Welcome, everybody. I'm Joel Hellman. I'm Dean of the School of Foreign Service here. It's great to have our live audience of students. It's also great to be on Facebook Live, and I welcome the audience that's joining us. Can I ask, first of all, for those who are here at the request of our panels today, we really would appreciate if you would consider masking. And I think there are masks available. Yeah, there are some masks available for those who don't have it. So if you have it, great. If you don't, you can get one towards the end. We really do appreciate your cooperation on that. So let me start. This is a difficult day for us here at Georgetown because obviously last night we lost an American icon and someone who played such a great role in shaping our school. So I'd like to start just in recognition, if we could ask everyone just for a moment of silence and reflection to recognize the life and great contribution of Madeleine Albright. Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, I had an opportunity to speak with Secretary Albright only a few weeks ago. And I'm so pleased to report that she was as energetic and as vibrant as she always was and as deeply engaged as she always was. And of course, what we talked about, this was just before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, was her great fear of essentially a challenge to everything she worked for throughout her life, which was to support and preserve democracy and human rights, which was in particular to recognize the travails in the European continent, which she and her family had to flee, and the notion that after all of her work in her professional and intellectual life to support the development of democracy and human rights across the European space, to see it threatened, and at the time it was still a threat, an impending threat, as you imagine, was deeply troubling to her. So it is appropriate that we reflect on her legacy by reflecting on the extraordinary challenge to everything that she believed in that we see now in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've had many events already in the course of the last few weeks to try to understand those events. And one of the things I think we've seen from all of those events is that all the theories that you're learning in your international affairs classes, all of the thinking that we've done about understanding Russian and Russian behavior, and Ukrainian behavior, what we knew about the leaders themselves, so much of that has not really provided a foundation for predictions of the extraordinary events that we're sort of seeing unfold over these last terrible weeks. And it's in that environment that the critical importance that journalists on the ground who are not just reporting on what's going on, revealing what's happening, but in this crisis in particular, more so than I've seen in any other, the reporting on the fly is helping us to build policy on the fly, helping change perceptions, helping change actions. I think what we've sort of seen happening on the ground in Ukraine, what we've heard happening in Moscow, and the decision-making and leadership in Moscow, what we've sort of seen in the use in President Zelensky's extraordinary use of his ability to reach out to the world has changed behavior, has changed policy, and will continue to change policy, American policy, European policy, and policy around the world. So we're so privileged today to have two great members of the SFS community in particular who have played an extraordinary critical role in reporting on the front lines. And so I'm so happy to welcome them here today, and I'm so happy to have you get a chance to hear from them about what they've seen and what it means. So without further ado, let me, to introduce them properly, let me ask our professor, Michael David Fox, who runs our Center for Eurasian, East European, and Russian Studies, to come introduce our panelists, and then we'll have a wonderful opportunity to hear from them and ask questions. So thank you very much for being here. Over to you, Michael.
Good morning. I'm Michael David Fox. I'm director of the Center of Eurasian, Russian, East European Studies here in the SFS. And as Dean Hellman said, there are a lot of profound reconsiderations on many, many levels going on, and CERES is very proud to co-sponsor this event as part of our ongoing and stepped up coverage of this terrible war. I just want to alert you to a couple of upcoming events that we're also sponsoring for Georgetown students and faculty alone, unfortunately, but this is for a Zoom call with someone who is in Lviv, Andrei Kohut, director of the SBU archive, which is the former KGB archive, has been at the center of the history politics that are close to the center of this war. He'll be talking with us either on Tuesday or Wednesday. It's a little bit up in the air because he's inside Ukraine, but if you want to be part of that call, you can contact me or look at the CERES website for upcoming events. You can also see all our events on our YouTube channel, CERES Georgetown. Now, normally, Jill Dougherty's Russia Brief, which is sponsored also by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, has Jill interviewing others, but since she was in Moscow reporting for CNN for the first weeks of this war, she is being interviewed. And I just want to say that Jill Dougherty is an adjunct professor at CERES. She's former Moscow bureau chief from CNN. She also served as White House correspondent and State Department correspondent for CNN. And she's also an alumna, MA alumna of Georgetown, and I just learned this morning that her mentor was Angela Stent when she was here. Alex Marquardt, SFS 04, is CNN's senior national security correspondent. He served previously as a foreign correspondent for ABC News, first in Moscow, then in Jerusalem and Beirut. And among his many awards are the News and Documentary Emmy Award for outstanding investigative reporting in a newscast. Moderating will be Angela Stent. She is senior advisor at CERES. She's director emerita of CERES. She served in the Office of Policy Planning at the U.S. Department of State and as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She is a leading authority on Russian-American relations, on Russian foreign policy, on Russian-German relations, and among her many books are the book Putin's World, and most recently, The Limits of Partnership. So, Angela.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dean Hellman and Professor David Fox, and I'm delighted to have Jill and Alex here. I've really benefited from your reporting so much, and a lot of what I know about what's happened in the Russian-Ukraine war, I know from you. Before we get started, I just wanted to add a few words also about Madeleine Albright, and her death is really a great loss to Georgetown and to the United States and really to the democratic world. She was my colleague for 40 years at Georgetown, and I also worked for her when I was in the Office of Policy Planning in the Department of State. And I think because she was a double refugee, she was a refugee from Nazism and communism. She understood very well how important it was to push back against aggressive dictators, to fight for democracy and freedom. And that really informed so much of what she did. She was largely responsible, obviously with her other colleagues, for ensuring that the United States got involved in the wars of succession in Yugoslavia when she saw the slaughter that was going on there, and also that NATO began to enlarge. She was a great supporter of it, and we can only just ask ourselves what it would be like to be in Poland, for instance, today, were Poland not a member of NATO. So she was so instrumental in doing all of that, and she was a beloved teacher. I know our students at CERES just couldn't wait to get into her courses. They had to compete to get into them. And the last time I was on a panel with her was at Georgetown when we were commemorating Václav Havel, of course, the great Czech president, whom she had brought to Georgetown. I remember that vividly in January of 1990, just after he had become president. So I think at one point people proposed that she should become president of the Czech Republic, but I think she turned that down. Anyway, her legacy will be with us, and obviously, if you go back and read the New York Times article from February the 23rd, the day before the war began, it really was very prescient in the way that she described Vladimir Putin. So I'm going to ask both of our panelists to make some introductory remarks about what it was like to be in Moscow, to be in Ukraine, reporting both before and after the war. I'll ask them some more questions, and then we look forward to your questions and comments. I'm going to begin with Jill Dougherty, and I am going to ask you, Jill, how you got into, first of all, to be interested in this part of the world, and then to become a journalist.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Angela. And I owe so much of my intellectual life to Angela, because I had been working in television for a very long time when I decided to get a master's degree. And after many years in TV, your brain begins to kind of shrink a little bit. So, I actually was so excited. I felt that air had suddenly come in my ears and I could think again. And Angela helped me to especially think about my thesis, which happened to be about Russia's soft power diplomacy, which seems like something like a joke at this point. But in any case, soft power diplomacy. So how did I get interested? Well, I am a creature of the Cold War, as you may have noticed. So I grew up in the 1950s, and luckily enough, in my school in Scranton, Pennsylvania, my high school, they had 4 years of Russian. So I have a twin sister, and we both thought, well, Spanish is interesting, French is interesting, German is interesting, but Russian sounds exotic. And my father was an FBI agent, so I thought, know the enemy. So, I started, and I absolutely fell in love with it. And it led me into it gave me a career, and it also gave me this kind of other life where I became I studied in high school, studied in college, University of Michigan, undergraduate, and became an exchange student in Leningrad at the time, St. Petersburg. And Leningrad at the time is where, I won't go into too many details, but that is where Vladimir Putin was getting his legal law degree at Leningrad State University, where I was a student. So now we never met him because obviously he was not consorting with foreigners. But I followed, then my life kind of intersected with his, and then I followed him ever since the beginning of his administration. So, and in journalism, my first job was with the Voice of America, way back when we were broadcasting by shortwave radio, which I understand BBC is going back to doing. How ironic, but shortwave radio. But that's what I did. So I was a broadcaster for about 6 years, and then got into TV, and then got into CNN. So I had a long career at CNN, 30 years. So CNN continues to use me, and I thought maybe I just kind of keep this brief, but I see some of my students here, which is really great. And what I try to do when I'm teaching is to try to give not the theoretical part of things. Sometimes I do, but I think there are people who are far better than I to do that. But I'll just give you an idea of how I ended up in Moscow covering this brutal war. So in typical CNN, and Alex, I think you will understand this, CNN months ago said, Jill, do you have an active visa for Russia? And I said, well, yes, indeed I do. And they said, okay, thank you. And then months go by, and then all of a sudden, they say, Jill, can you go to Moscow tomorrow? It was, it was really like that. But of course, because my field is Russian, I had been watching everything that was going on. And I have to admit that I'm one of the people who believed that Putin would do something, but I thought that he would take Donbass. I thought he would invade Donbass, take it over, and I wasn't quite sure what that meant because he already had it. But that's about as far as I thought. And when he actually attacked Ukraine proper, I really was shocked, and I think a lot of people were. There's a lot of discussion, we should have seen this, but in any case. So I ended up going rather unexpectedly. I did have to teach on a Monday, so I thought I'll finish teaching and then I would leave on a Tuesday, which is what I did. And maybe if I'm as kind of up close and detailed as possible, it might help you for those of you who are interested in journalism and kind of how all of this stuff happens behind the scenes. I did have a visa, which is not a journalist visa. It was because I'm in another group, which is what's called a Track 2 diplomatic group that tries to help relations with Russia, which is really, I hate to think what will happen with that. But in any case, so I had this, it's kind of like a humanitarian visa. So I got in no problem, started working immediately, and I was working overnights because what happens when CNN wants to do a big story, they just throw everything at it. So we had a number of people who were working both as reporters and producers. Producers were mainly Russians, but there were a couple of people from London. The reporters were outsiders. Nick Robertson was the other one. Fred Pleitgen, some of these names may be familiar, came in from time to time, but he was mainly in the field. So when you do that, you literally have to kind of make the trains, run. So who's going to work overnights? Who's going to work during the day? What will you watch? What will you do? So we had a producer who's really, really good, and I knew him, have extraordinary respect for him, and he was able to really make that bureau function. It was complex to do that because we could see that the foreign media, obviously, the Putin administration has completely decimated domestic media. And during that period, they passed this onerous law, which is just terrible, which defines, you could not, when the war broke out, can't use the word war, you cannot use the word attack, you cannot word, invasion, or you could go to prison for 15 years. And so when that came out, which is kind of the tail end of my story, we eventually had to leave. But what I did, and this is what I enjoy, is trying to interpret, what is this? I've been in war zones. I mean, anyone who's with CNN has worked in war zones, Afghanistan, Iraq, Georgian Civil War, a lot, Chechnya. But mainly, I'm kind of a political reporter. So what I tried to do was I watched TV all the time, which had suddenly morphed into 24-hour-a-day propaganda, which was really, just like as the phrase you probably know, the fire hose of disinformation. It really was. It was this constant. And the emotional tone, I teach another course on disinformation here at Georgetown, and it's perfect. In fact, that will probably be the basis for another course, because what they did was classic use of propaganda. High emotional tone, angry, the enemy, who are the fascists, all of this in quotes, of course, the fascist regime, the junta, the Nazis who are in Kiev. It was all demonization. But, and this is a little theoretical, I'll get back to the reality in a second, but they also, a lot of Russians have relatives in Ukraine. So you would ask yourself, how could the government make them hate Ukrainians? Well, they didn't do that. What they said, and this is a big part of the propaganda line, which is Ukraine is not a country. Of course, President Putin does not consider it a country. It belongs to Russia and always has. But it is a tool in the hands of NATO and especially the United States. I mean, this all boils down to the United States. It is a tool, a cudgel used by the United States to beat Russia, to attack Russia, do regime change, take over, they've been saying that for a long time, but it reached just this critical point. So Russians inside of Russia could say, I love my grandmother in Mykolaiv, in Ukraine. However, she and everybody in Ukraine is being exploited and abused by those terrible Americans who want to attack Russia. So intellectually, and I'd be interested in whether you saw that in action, Alex. So anyway, so there I am watching TV, and you could see there were two speeches that I would recommend to you by President Putin. One was on the 16th of March, and the other one was a few days later, actually, when he met with women who were working in the airline industry.
Was that real, by the way?
Well, nobody knows. I mean, but remember, President Putin had been at a table that was approximately as big as this stage, meeting with people that he supposedly trusts. He was at one end, the other person was at the other. Suddenly, I look up, and there's President Putin in a room with very nicely made up, very pretty women who are working, and it's not a sexist comment. This is really, sexism lives, and it is definitely in Russia. So I'm sorry, but it's true. I think most of my Russian friends would say that's true. So anyway, these very nicely made up women, and he is delivering two very long tirades about why he had to do this. It is impossible not to do this. It's not our fault. We're forced to do this, et cetera. So I watched these very carefully, and then what I would do in my reporting was try to explain, without obviously saying that I support what he's saying, but I would try to give some clarity to our viewers around the world, and especially in the United States. What is he saying? What is the justification for this war? How does he explain it? And Russian TV at that point had a piece that I think was very, very useful. It said, essentially, which is also part of Putin's message, I told you so. I've been saying this for years. I'm sure Angela knows this ad nauseum. But Putin has been saying for years, and he really has, at least 15 years, everything that I'm talking about, the West is out to get us. And so in this piece on Russian TV, they said, Putin actually knew that all of this was coming to a head 15 years ago, but the West wasn't listening. And then Putin has this famous phrase that he used in yet another speech where he said, you didn't listen, now listen to me. So I saw this, and the body language was important. The language deteriorated. There was a lot of there were colloquial expressions, slightly off, maybe not even slightly off color things, hints of sexism and, misogyny. And so Putin, the tough guy from the, kind of a tough neighborhood in Leningrad, whom I've been watching for a long time, came out. Very similar to what he did when he attacked Chechnya and started the Second Chechen War. So anyway, I'll try to get to a quick end here. The other part of this was, there are two other parts. One is, I'm living in a hotel which is right across from the Bureau, which is a 5-star hotel. And I am not opposed to living in 5-star hotels. But the company has a deal, so we can live there rather cheaply, and you can walk across the street really fast. So I'm staying in this hotel full of rich Russians. And these are the type of people, I would swim every day. So I would walk into the women's changing room, and there would be like a Louis Vuitton bag thrown on the floor, and women with these really expensive outfits, and there I am in my American rags, working out. And so I saw, I started thinking, ooh, wow, these people are going to have a big awakening very soon. And as sanctions hit, credit cards stopped working, Visa stopped working, MasterCard. My American Express, which was the only card that I had left, worked the morning that I checked out of the hotel, and then it stopped working that afternoon. So I'm not quite sure how I would have, absconded without paying my bill. And then the other thing, and this I will end with, is I have a lot of friends in Moscow. And so I tried to see people. I had a really, really intense schedule, but I tried to have coffee with people. One person, good friend of mine, a journalist, pretty well known, said, yeah, let's have coffee Wednesday. I'll see you then. And then I got this cryptic message, my family and I are going to go on vacation. Sorry, can't make it. And I thought, I didn't follow up because I knew what was happening. So he fled the country. Another close friend, we went to coffee, and as we're sitting there, I said, so what are you going to do? And she said, well, I have plan A, B, and C. And I realized that I couldn't ask her what those plans were. I did not want any details. And because it was very possible that at that point I was being followed, not because they're going to do anything to me particularly, but they could do things to my friends. So I didn't want any information. She got out. And I have more and more friends who during this last few weeks have left, and they don't know whether they're going to ever get back. Some have bank accounts and apartments and lives in Russia. They don't know whether they're going to get back to it. And so I think, Alex will probably fill you in on the Ukraine part of it, but I will say this is a very big tragedy for Russia, for Russia's citizens, who, a lot of whom do not support the war. It feels very much to me like 1917. I think, there are people who are going to leave and never, ever get back. The country will be losing the best and the brightest. It is turning much more into a repressive regime. And I know this all sounds like, things that you hear on TV or whatever, but it's a human tragedy. I mean, 4 weeks ago, my friends were going to theater openings and discussing books and going to concerts but planning a vacation and also in communication, getting information from the rest of the world on a relatively free basis, relatively. And now Putin wants a sovereign internet, which he can just flip off, like a switch. And to me, that is really terrible, and it is terrible for people your age. So I think we have to remember, Ukrainians are dying, and I think, Russia, to a certain extent, is dying. The Russia that I was hoping for, people your age, and people who are the age of the students in my class, which is called the Putin generation. I may have to change that title, but in any way, thank you, and please, Alex.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jill. I mean, you and I were both graduate students or students in the Soviet Union, and I think all of us have, the last couple of years already, started to adapt to behaving when we're there, as if it were, in my case, the 1970s. So, yeah. I mean, and some of my Russian friends have said it's almost like going back to the 1950s. So it is, It's a tragedy for Russia. Thank you. We'll come back to that. Alex, please tell us how you got interested in being a journalist. I know you've had some experience in Moscow, and of course about your experiences in Ukraine in the recent weeks.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me and for having me back. It's always really jarring when I first get up here to talk to Georgetown students, because I still think that I'm one of you. And then I see my name that says SFS 04, and I realize it's 18 years later. So, but thank you so much. It's a real honor to be alongside Jill, who I've looked up to for a very, very long time, after such an incredible few weeks. I want to go back to where the dean started with Madeleine Albright. Since I got back to from Ukraine about 10 days ago, I've been covering the war from the DC side of things, and specifically at the State Department. I spent the entire week at the State Department. And I was there yesterday when I got a call from our what we call our desk, which is our headquarters, telling me that they were getting word that Secretary Albright had passed away. And I had to start getting ready and get read up on her enormous legacy and work. And obviously, having been at Georgetown, I was well acquainted with her role here. I did not get into her class when I was a student here, which was a great regret of mine. Graduated in 2004, and then 10 years later, I was in Ukraine in May for their presidential election. And this was just after President Viktor Yanukovych had been deposed. This was an election that Secretary Albright was there to observe. This was 14 years after she had left office. Aside from being a professor at Georgetown, she was still very involved in democratic efforts around the world, strengthening democracy, observing elections. So she was there to observe the election. I was at ABC at the time. She gave us a very long interview, and we had a long chat afterwards. She gave us far more time than she needed to. And I remember at the end of it, she said, now we're heading off to Brazil. I can't remember what it was for, but she's like, do you want to come with me to Brazil? And I was like, I would love to jet off to Brazil with you. I've got an election to cover here and a job to do. But I looked up yesterday after we got the news, what I had written and done with that interview at the time. And she had said to me that election was the first step towards restoring Ukrainians' dignity, which was just so, it was so relevant to what we're seeing now, which really is the Ukrainians fighting for their dignity, for their country, for their right to exist as a people. Now, how had I gotten there? Well, I will try to keep it short. I had started my foreign correspondent career in Moscow in 2009 with ABC News. I knew I wanted to be a foreign correspondent. ABC had an open bureau there. And I thought this is a terrific place to get my feet wet as a foreign correspondent. Sometimes I joke that it was the most boring period in recent Russian history because President Medvedev was in power, one of the brief period that President Putin has not been in power in the past 2 decades. President Obama had just been elected. I got there right during his first visit in July of 2009. This was during the famous reset between the US and Russia. Secretary Clinton presented Foreign Minister Lavrov with a button that she thought said reset on it. It actually said something else in Russian. So it was a relatively calm and friendly era between the two countries. During my time there was a bit of a kerfuffle over adoptions and the rights of Americans to adopt Russian children, but that was about as far as it got in terms of diplomatic spats. So I moved on to the Middle East, and then and I covered some wars in the region, the Arab Spring, wars in Gaza, in Syria, the revolution in Egypt. So when the uprising started in early 2014 in Ukraine, I was both well acquainted with the region and with the dynamics of protest and conflicts and potentially war. And I got to Kyiv in May of 2014, right when Yanukovych was kicked out, and he quickly ran off to Russia, where I believe he still is. And then very quickly, we started to hear murmurs about Crimea and what designs President Putin might have on Crimea. And so I went down there, and yet again, I got a call from our bosses back in New York saying, we're seeing reports of mysterious troops who've moved into Crimea. So I headed out to the airport, and sure enough, there were men dressed in camouflage, patrolling with their guns, no insignia, no patches, no flags, very quietly, very peacefully. We asked them who they were, where they were from. They wouldn't say anything. And these were the little green men who would eventually take over Crimea. And at the time, that was the most extraordinary, one of the most extraordinary stories I had covered. Ukraine's military was absolutely no match for the Russians. And over the course of several weeks, the Russians managed to take over this entire landmass essentially without firing a shot. They took over military base by military base, one after the next, essentially without firing a shot. And my lasting memory of Crimea will be on a base called Baalbek, I was with the Ukrainian forces. Russian special forces stormed in, and there was no firing, but there was a whole shouting match between the two sides where, well, essentially from the Ukrainian side, shouting at the Russians saying, "You are our brothers. What are you doing? Why are you here?" And there was a referendum shortly thereafter, in quotes, 90+% voting to join Russia. And that's where it starts to get a little bit complicated, because you could make the argument that if there were a free and fair election in a place like Crimea, that they might actually vote to join Russia because they felt like it should be part of Russia. From there, I moved up into the Donbass, into eastern Ukraine, spent a lot of time in Donetsk, was there when they broke away as a republic, which President Putin has just now recognized as being independent. Anyway, flashing forward about 10 years. About 5 years ago, I moved back to the US. I became a national security correspondent here in DC, which is much more of a sort of political role, but it let me keep a toe in foreign policy, and particularly the areas that I used to cover, the Middle East and in Russia. And so when Putin started massing troops around the Ukrainian border, I was able to raise my hand and say to my bosses, "Hey, I have this experience in Ukraine and Russia. I now have this experience in DC. You know, I'd like to get involved." And so I traveled with Secretary Blinken to Europe in December when he was visiting a number of NATO countries. I covered the talks between Russia and NATO and the US in January. And as soon as I got on the plane home in January, I wrote to my boss saying, "If Russia invades, I really, really want to be part of this." And I got to Ukraine on February 6th, so about 2.5 weeks before the invasion started. There's part of me that wishes I'd gotten there a little bit later, because I would have had more energy physically by the time the war actually started. As Jill was saying, it's very tiring to work those hours when you're 7 hours, in her case, 8 hours ahead of the US, let alone when you're running around all day in a war zone. But the benefit of having gotten there when I did was that I got to see the country before the war again. And crisscrossed, I was all over the place. I was in Crimea, I was in Mariupol, which a month ago, most people in this room probably hadn't heard of, but now everybody knows. I was in eastern Ukraine in a place called Volnovakha, which is now essentially burned to the ground. And so I got to spend a lot of time seeing the country and speaking with people. And really what stood out was this extraordinary defiance where there wasn't a single person I met who really thought that the war was going to start. Meanwhile, you had the US, shouting from the rooftops that this war is about to begin. Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, saying it's going to probably start before the end of the Olympics on February 20th. And they just didn't believe it. Now, whether that was as a result of President Zelensky and his top officials saying, we don't believe the war is going to happen. I mean, literally the day before the war happened, President Zelensky said there will be no war. Or whether it was because they didn't believe it themselves. I heard time and time again, particularly from people in the East and the Southeast in Mariupol, saying, we've lived with this war for 8 years. Keep in mind, since 2014, there was this simmering war in the Donbass that was largely ignored by the world, 14,000+ people killed. And they said, we're used to this. If it happens, we'll be ready. And so on the one hand, you had this denial that anything was going to happen, but also this defiance of, if it happens, we're ready. Our military is much stronger. The West has sent in a ton of weapons. Every Ukrainian is ready to pick up a gun and fight. And that seemed like bravado at the time. But when the war actually started, that did come to pass. And one of the most extraordinary things to witness was this, not only the strength of the Ukrainian military that we now know has done a fantastic job of keeping the Russians at bay, particularly around Kyiv, but also this extraordinary patriotism that has, I don't want to say sprung up, but is obvious, not just because they're under attack, but largely because of what President Putin did 8 years ago in seizing Crimea, and then supporting the breakaway republics and really fostering, which has led to a real Ukrainian nationalism and patriotism. So seeing Ukrainians joining the territorial defenses, taking the guns that every Ukrainian is allowed to pick up if they want to go and fight, and seeing President Zelensky, who, as we all know, was an actor and a comedian, turn into a true statesman, a true hero that people are now just recognizing all around the world, in part because of these daily updates that he's been giving. We've been surprised on so many levels. U.S. intelligence got so many things right in terms of what the Russians were planning, but at the same time got a number of things wrong in terms of what we expected from the Russian military, which has fallen apart in many ways, what we expected from the Ukrainian people, from the Ukrainian military, and from the Ukrainian president. So coming full circle, the fight that we're now seeing, and I'm happy to get into some more of the behind the scenes and how we reported and that kind of thing, because these were incredibly tense days, incredibly long days, staying up till 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning to be on the air in what was prime time in the United States. Every time Wolf Blitzer, Jake Tapper would say, well, Jill Dougherty's in Moscow and Alex Marquardt is in Kyiv, I'd sort of have to pinch myself to not, the fact that I was alongside the great Jill Dougherty was something that I still haven't really gotten used to. And it was an incredibly fulfilling time as a journalist, obviously extremely sad to see a country being torn apart, encouraging to see what the Ukrainians have done in response. I came out after about 5 weeks, and obviously we don't really believe there's any near end in sight. But this is truly, as Secretary Albright said, this is the fight for the dignity of Ukrainians. And just a month ago, right before the war started, she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and she said what President Putin was planning was a historic mistake. And I truly believe that. And that is in part why I didn't fully believe that he would go through with what he has. As Jill mentioned, I think we all thought he would do something, but not on the scale that he has, and I do believe that it will prove to be a historic mistake.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, even those of us that are allegedly experts on this, and even though our intelligence agencies were telling us they're going to invade, and my colleagues who are military analysts in this country said they're going to invade, but the rest of us, again, thought, well, it'll just probably be the Donbass. So I think we just had a hard time believing that anyone would do that so unprovoked. Did you meet any Ukrainians that were pro-Russian, that were critical of Zelensky?
I think there's a gradient that I think that goes across the country, where obviously the farther west you go, the more anti-Russian you get, and the more pro-European you're getting. I certainly think that there were a lot of people in the Donbass, who, for example, when you go into stores or gas stations it was always interesting to me which language people would speak first. I mean, Ukrainians, by and large, are perfectly bilingual. Speak excellent Russian, obviously speak excellent Ukrainian, and I certainly think since 2014, there are a lot of Ukrainians who have made an effort to really speak Ukrainian first and to use their national language rather than Russian, which is certainly more prominent in the older generations. In the East, in Donbass, I mean, you're certainly going to find a lot of people who are ethnic Russian, who are Russian speakers first. And you're certainly going to find a number of people who think, for example, Donetsk and Luhansk should have a lot more autonomy and a lot more independence. I didn't meet anybody who was outwardly sort of anti-Zelensky per se, but there was certainly there was a sentiment of, among some, and it's hard to put numbers on it, but that we are ethnic Russians. We would like more autonomy from Kyiv. But at the same time, I was in Mariupol when the war started, and immediately there were protests there with people saying, we don't need saving. That was President Putin's pretext, was that he needs to go in and save these ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. And so you did, I don't want to even call it a division, and again, it's hard to put numbers on these things. But yes, you're going to find people who are more pro Moscow than Kyiv. But that patriotism was felt far and wide, and that was really remarkable.
So, Jill, there are obviously a lot of rumors about what's happening in the top circles in Moscow, and obviously none of us really know what's happening there. But, and they grow day by day, and different people from the FSB being arrested maybe, and the report on CNN about the general who was talking to his American counterpart and then, was very emotional when the subject of Ukraine came up. Did you hear sort of, what kind of rumors did you hear? And we know Moscow's always rife with rumors when you were there about potential opposition to this at the highest levels.
Well, there were, I'd say maybe a week after the war began, there were heavy rumors about Putin being extremely frustrated. Maybe it's a week and a half, but that he was extremely frustrated that things were not going well, and that he was beginning to slowly but surely kind of purge, might be the word, some people in the military and especially the intelligence. So there were a couple of people, I believe this is true, but again, this is where it gets very difficult when you're covering a situation like this, but that there were two intelligence people, you probably remember, who were under house arrest. And that was taken as a symbol of, or a sign that Putin was really angry about how things were going. He also, just trying to think, there were a couple of other indications. Well, we have Chubais, which is the most recent. This Anatoly Chubais just happened 2 days ago, I think. Yeah, yesterday. Time flies. Where he used to be in the old Yeltsin days. He was called, an economic reformer, but economic reform was very painful for a lot of Russians. So there are a lot of people who might intellectually or kind of be from his economic group, but also the average people may hate him for what he did. Anyway, he was still part of the administration of Putin. He stepped down and left the country because he opposes the war. Now, Putin, as I said last night on TV, Putin is probably going to say, who cares, good riddance. Because, Putin is not listening to anybody right now. And I think just to these rumors, how they all start. For 2 years, he has been under extraordinary control because of COVID. So people who had to see him had to, be in isolation for 2 weeks. In fact, the rumor about those women, the airline women, is that they had been in isolation for 2 weeks before they even got into the room. So he has physically seen very few people. And then his mentality, and that's another subject, but his mentality, I think, has become very hardened. And so the hard men around him, what they call the siloviki, the strong men, are really maybe even worse than he is in terms of wanting to cut Russia off, show the West, et cetera. So he's been both influenced and influencing people who are around him. Nobody likes to tell the boss any bad news. So any indication that the war isn't going well, who is going to risk his, neck to tell the president, hey, this plan isn't working? So, shakeups, yes, there are a lot of different rumors. It's hard to say precisely what's happening. I wish I could.
I mean, Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister,
yes.
He disappeared, right? But here he is today, a meeting on the screen on a Zoom with
And
Putin.
people are saying, when was that recorded? Because there was video. I will tell you a personal experience, and this is, I can't believe this. Putin, in one of his announcements about the war, I'm trying to think whether it was the actual announcement.
It was a declaration of war, I think. That was filmed, obviously, a couple of days before, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I'm watching, I remember that scene because when he announced the war, he's sitting at a desk. He has a dark kind of purple tie on. He has Soviet-type phones. They used to have, like 12 different phones. You pick them up, and he had like 4 or 5 phones. And I remember I watched it for so long that I had memorized that picture of him. Next day I get to the office and I have a cup of coffee and I'm watching TV, but we had the sound down. Or maybe it was 2 days later. And I saw what looked like the same video on Russian TV. And I thought, oh, they're just replaying him from the other day. And we didn't turn up the sound. And it was another, announcement of horrors. And suddenly I had this funny instinctive feeling, wait a minute, is this old or is this new? What's happening? So indeed, it was another speech that had obviously been recorded that same day in the same position, but it was played a day or two later. So even in that, it was like the people in the old days, which you won't remember, but people used to be on Lenin's tomb, and then suddenly, for parades, suddenly they would disappear. They would be taken out of the photograph. And I had that same feeling that, oh my God, this is all fake. And that picture with the women, there was a heavy rumor that was a green screen, that actually the women were someplace else. I have no idea. But it's very hard to report under circumstances like that, because you can take propaganda and begin to spread it. And the Kremlin was spreading a lot of propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, the fake news. And today, the Russian Foreign Ministry shows a picture of Mariupol and says this was done by Ukrainians. Oh. I mean, this is the extent of the falsification of everything. So,
can I pick up on that as well?
Sure.
There was to Jill's point about how choreographed this was, because the entire question lead up to the war was, will he or won't he? Will he actually pull the trigger and do it, or not? And that's one great example of how we know how choreographed this was, because it had been recorded several days in advance. There was another one. You'll remember this extraordinary meeting at the Kremlin where President Putin had all of his national security team in front of him. And he was asking them one by one, what do you think I should do in terms of recognizing these two breakaway republics? And one by one, they stood up and said, we think you should recognize these republics. And we knew that if he ended up doing it, that would be the first step towards a war. And then later on, in Moscow, there was the signing of these documents with the two heads of these breakaway republics. And internet sleuths pulled in on their watches, and you could see what time of day it was, and that had actually happened before the meeting with the national security officials. So we already knew. So then we figured out that he had already determined at the time when he met with his national security team that he was already going to recognize those breakaway republics. And then there was another example. A couple days later, there was an announcement by the heads of those two breakaway republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, where they said, we are announcing evacuations from these territories because of the offensives that are being launched by the Ukrainian military. It didn't take much effort to dig into the metadata of these recorded videos to find out that they had been recorded 48 hours prior. So all of this was, Russia tried to characterize this as, something that was, obviously that they had no choice but to do, and that he was deciding in that moment to do it. But there were all these examples of things that showed later on that this was just part of an unfolding communication strategy that was very easy to poke holes in.
Could I just jump in too? Because for the people who are interested in journalism, the CNN, and I'm presuming other people, but CNN I really do think does it best. We have people now, and a lot of them are young, who do, Alex mentioned metadata. So that we have teams who actually analyze pieces of video that come in, could be from phones or whatever. They do the metadata analysis. They do geolocation to figure out, was that actually shot where they said it was shot? And so this is an entirely, a different area of journalism where you have to, try to understand what is true. It's kind of like, the Truth Squad, but it's very sophisticated. There's some really smart people who are doing this right now at CNN.
New journalism.
Yeah.
Alex, let me ask you from your experiences there, what kind of a political settlement do you think would be acceptable to Ukrainians, right?
It's a terrific question, and I would just agree with Jill that if anybody's interested in journalism, that open source journalism is the next wave. It is the most exciting thing that's happening in journalism right now. Not just CNN, but New York Times and others are doing a fantastic job. I sometimes wish I was 15 years younger and I would start on that path. It is a very interesting question of where the peace talks are, I don't want to call them peace talks, the discussions are going. The Russians are calling them negotiations. I think that's a little bit more than they actually are. We've had now several rounds of talks between the Russian and the Ukrainian side, primarily in Belarus. There's been one high-level meeting between the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia, and by all accounts, they really haven't gone anywhere. What I'm watching closely and what I think will be very interesting is if the Russians are able to take Mariupol, which they likely will because they're absolutely decimating it, they will create what we've been calling a land bridge between Crimea and Western Russia, between Crimea and the breakaway republics and Western Russia. So that will be an entire strip of Ukraine that has been cut off and seized by the Russians. As one European defense official told me, that's when the talks will begin in earnest, because that's when Russia will have achieved what we believe to be one of its main goals, and that is territorial control of Crimea, much of the Donbass, and those breakaway republics in the Donbass. And then the question becomes, does he want more of the Donbass, the entire eastern side there? So what's on the table? We've heard time and time again that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. You've got the big NATO meeting today, and Zelensky made a speech there in which he notably did not call for a no-fly zone, but it appears that Zelensky has backed off this insistence that Ukraine join NATO, recognizing not only that it's a major demand of the Russians, but NATO doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO anytime soon either. So what does that neutrality look like? This is the word that we've been hearing more and more of. We've also heard about demilitarization, the Russians demanding demilitarization of Ukraine. Now, that is probably something that Ukraine is not going to agree to. What country is going to agree to demilitarize? But they could agree to some kind of neutrality. The example of Austria has been brought up a number of times. What would neutrality look like? Well, it would mean not joining NATO for one, which we know is going to happen, which we know won't happen. But Ukraine would also require security guarantees. Which countries are going to sign up to guarantee the security of Ukraine? Remember, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for a security agreement with Russia. Now you've got Russia invading Ukraine. So will the US, will the Brits, will the Germans, will the French, will they sign up to guarantee Ukraine's security if Ukraine does not join NATO? So that's the neutrality question is one where it appears some of the most progress has been made. We should keep in mind that the talks are extremely opaque. I mean, I just mentioned I've spent a lot of time in the State Department lately. I don't think the U.S. knows all that much about what's happening behind closed doors. And if they do, maybe it's Secretary Blinken and the National Security Council and President Biden. But we don't know a lot about the details of these talks. And then the next question is about territorial recognition. Russia is going to want Crimea to be recognized as Russian. And they're going to want the breakaway republics to be recognized as independent. And that's where Zelensky gets into very tough territory, because that is what I think about a third of the country or a quarter of the country. He's not, he's got this enormous base of support right now. He's not going to agree, and Ukrainians are not going to want him to agree, given the successes they've had, to give up that much of the country. So then that's where you get into some of the nitty-gritty of what is recognition. Do you allow the breakaway republics to hold a referendum in order to determine what level of autonomy they have from the Kyiv government? So those are the major areas that we're watching. It looks like progress has been made in neutrality. There will be some discussion over some level of recognition of those other areas. But one of the places where Russia is probably going to have to give is on a completely new government. Remember that one of their primary goals has been to cut off Kyiv, strangle it, decapitate the Zelensky government, possibly early on, the reports were that they wanted to kill Zelensky. The Turks, who are carrying out one channel of these discussions, there are multiple channels, have said that Putin has recognized that Zelensky is, the head of the Ukrainian government and that he's not going anywhere anytime soon. And that's another interesting part of all this is you've got the Ukrainians and Russians speaking bilaterally one-on-one. You've got the Turks who are doing some level of moderation. You've got Prime Minister Bennett of Israel who's trying to act as a go-between. You've got President Macron, Chancellor Scholz, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, all speaking with President Putin. Everybody is trying their best to support these discussions and to really get them to a good place where progress can be made. But as things stand right now, very little progress has been made. The contours of the discussions have been essentially settled on. But the primary focus, the gap exists in the priorities of these countries. The priority for Ukraine is to stop the fighting, get Russian troops out of their country. And then the priorities for Russia are these maximalist demands of never join NATO, demilitarize, be neutral, and recognize these territories. So they're still quite far apart.
Thank you. Okay, we now have time for questions. So I guess, do we have someone with a microphone? We do. All right. We have two microphones. All right.
Hi, my name is Megan Skinner. I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service. And my question for either or both of you pertaining to your extensive careers is, what is the hardest event or piece of information that you've had to report on in your careers? And how did it change your view of your role as a journalist in international affairs? Thank you.
Jill?
Well, I would start with, if you have heard the word Beslan, it was an attack, a terrorist attack on a school in Russia, in the south of Russia. And I have never forgotten about it. I think I was scarred by it. These terrorists came in. This is kind of the Chechnya period. So these are Islamic terrorists from that region in the Caucasus who came to a school on the first day of school. Mothers are there with their little kids, and they take over the school, throwing bombs, the whole thing, herd them into an auditorium like this, and keep them there for, I think it was at least 3 or 4 days, and did not let them out. So they were held under extraordinarily horrible circumstances with no water, no nothing. Anyone who tried to escape was basically killed. When I got there, the Russian forces decided that they were going to save these children and their mothers. So they came in their ham-handed way and fired on the building, set fire to the roof inadvertently. The roof collapses on top of all of these people. And so some people were burned to death, and then others tried to run. Little kids were shot in the back. It was really, really bad. So after that, we had to go through the ruins where you could still smell dead bodies and burnt hair. And I remember seeing this father who took his little kid through the building and said, "Look, this is what they did." And I thought, why would you ever take your child into a circumstance like this? It was disgusting and horrendous and petrifying. But he did. So what did I draw from that? Number one, that things like that are really hard. People who are killed and things like that are very hard because there is kind of a switch that goes off. I mean, I did that, but it affected me. And I remember going back at night, and as we went by that building, there was, I presume, a father who was inside that building at night all by himself. And I heard this noise, and I thought it was like an animal screaming. And it was the father, I presume the father, who was screaming like an animal in pain because he had obviously lost children. So what did I draw? Again, it's difficult to do these things. The bestiality of terrorism, and then also the incompetent cruelty of the Russian government and the security forces, who actually created more of a problem in a way. And they did that. This is a period where we were covering a lot of terrorism, and they were constantly going in to rescue people and killing them in the process. The theater takeover, you know, with fentanyl, where they, anyway, I could go on. But I think that's it. I've covered a lot of stuff in my life, but it continues to haunt me. I wonder what those women are doing now. They went, you know, to the graves of their kids. I wonder. I don't know.
It's obviously critically important to cover high-level summits, presidential meetings, that kind of thing, and those get a lot of attention. You know, what's happening at NATO today with President Biden being there and other world leaders. That's crucial. But I think the stuff that resonates the most, both for the audience in the world and for us as reporters, are going to be those personal stories. And in every episode, in every conflict, there are going to be countless examples of those. And through those personal stories, what you're hoping to do is to show what's going on, influence the conversation, and play a role, as you say, in international affairs. And the one that stood out to me this past time was there was a village just south of Kyiv that we heard had been bombed. Tiny little village. And we went out there 2 days afterwards, so 48 hours later, and met this man in his 50s digging in the rubble with his neighbors. His name was Igor. And come to find out that he had lost 5 of his family members and a family friend. 6 people in one strike from a missile that had been dropped from a plane, we believe. Left a huge crater in the ground. And he was digging through the rubble, looking for, he kept saying he was looking for his documents. And I thought, you're never going to find anything. I mean, just, it's rock and everything torn to shreds. And these 2 cars were completely torched. And so you really saw the power of this attack. Sure enough, he found his wallet and his passport while we were there. And he found his 2 cats, and he threw them in his car. And as Jill's saying, it's the toughest thing you can do, because you are meeting people on the worst day of their life. And it's very difficult to go up to someone on the worst day of their life and say, tell me how bad it is, and tell me how you're feeling, and tell me what you're going to do next. It can feel like you're preying on someone. It can feel dirty and upsetting, and like you're taking advantage of them. And then you have to remember that that story is going to hopefully have a far-reaching impact, is going to help our audience understand what is truly going on in Ukraine. And yesterday, again, at the State Department, they announced the war crimes are being committed by Russian forces, and that is because they are hitting civilians like Igor and his family. It was the one time in my entire stint in Ukraine that I was happy that I didn't speak Ukrainian, because I would ask the questions, and my translator would translate them, and I would get the answers back in Ukraine, and I would nod and pick up a few things here and there because there are words that sound like Russian. And I got back, and my translator sent me the translation, and it was just devastating. It was absolutely devastating. And I called my fiance, Amanda, who's sitting in the front row here, and it was I broke down, and it's very, very difficult. But again, it's not about you. They're having the worst day of their life, and your job is to get that story out there, and hopefully it will have an impact.
Next question. Over here. Oh.
Hi, my name is Andre. I'm a sophomore in the McDonald School of Business. And I guess my question is more about the semantics of how you talk about Ukraine, specifically how you use the term neutrality. Because in my perspective, that's a really strong narrative that's being pushed by Russia, and I never saw it being used in the US as widely as you have been using it. I think I'm specifically I think the question is to Mr. Marquardt. So I was just wondering where you get the term from and whether it's a result of your personal evaluation or whether you heard it somewhere and you use it in this state. And another question is, in terms of neutrality, some of the things you talk about specifically, some security concerns or some security kind of signees by other countries, I don't think that's one of the options Ukrainian people or Ukrainian government is looking into because we know what happened in 1994. So my question is, as a National Security Council reporter, how closely do you communicate back with what the actual position is in Ukraine, and how much do you count with people beyond the geopolitical theory and how they actually feel about the situation?
It's a good question about who actually said the word neutrality first. I'm not quite sure, but it's one that's been out there.
Zelensky's been talking about it.
Right, but
Before that.
Yeah. Either way, it's not a controversial term. I mean, it's one that's again, it's been used before in the case of Austria, but this is something that is being pursued obviously by Zelensky, understanding that they're not going to join NATO, and so the question now is really just sort of what shape does that take, and as I was saying, who are the signatories who will guarantee Ukrainian security short of joining NATO. Now, there's also the question of whether they join the European Union. Both of those bodies are written into the Ukrainian constitution, and President Zelensky has asked, has applied obviously for EU membership, and while that might not happen in the immediate future, it is something that the EU has responded to positively. I'm not quite sure whether this is answering your question, but the U.S., for example, is always getting the question of, who's essentially leading here? Because the U.S. obviously has concerns and priorities here as well, and the State Department will tell you that it's the Ukrainians who are setting the agenda. It's they who are sitting at the table. It is obviously their concerns that are paramount, and then it is them who are going to set the tone, and the U.S. will follow their lead. But even if there were a peace deal tomorrow, does that mean the U.S., for example, is going to drop its sanctions? You have differences between how the Europeans are viewing things and applying their sanctions versus the U.S. But obviously, the biggest priority right now is what is it that Ukraine is striving for? What is it that Ukraine wants? And if they believe that some form of neutrality is going to help to end this war, then I think you'll find much of NATO in support of that. Does that answer your question?
I think we should. All right, there's a question here in the second row, okay?
Hi, my name is Katie Cooper, and I'm a sophomore in the SFS. And first of all, I just wanted to thank you guys for coming to speak with us today. This is a really awesome opportunity. So at Georgetown, I'm on the club basketball team, so I tend to closely follow women's sports. So my question pertains to the detention of Brittany Griner in Russia. She's been detained for currently over a month due to vape cartridges in her luggage. And it's obvious to be concerned for her safety as an American citizen, person of color, and a member of the LGBTQ community. So I was wondering to hear your opinion on whether the detention of Brittany Griner is a coincidence with the timing of this conflict, if Putin is trying to send a message, or any thoughts that you have on this situation.
Well, I do not know officially, but I would have to say the timing is pretty obvious. And I would also say the timing that she is a Black woman and that she's gay also may have contributed. There's a bit of, scorn and in the Russian government toward people like that, as we know. So I really feel sorry for her circumstance, and I don't know how it's going to end, because right now Putin is trying to prove a point, and he'll do whatever he needs to do, he thinks he needs to do.
it's extremely unfortunate timing
Yeah.
for her that, that she happened to be arrested when all this is going on.
There was some
Yeah.
positive news yesterday. In that only American diplomats were able to visit her.
Oh,
So
finally.
consular visits by American diplomats are required throughout the world if a citizen has been arrested. And in the cases of Paul Whelan and Trevor Reed and Brittany Griner until now, that had been denied for her until now. So that was the bit of good news that we got yesterday. The State Department said that she's being treated as well as she could in this situation. So that was a positive step. But there's a major question now, which you just asked, of how closely linked her case is with the war, and it's very hard to tell. But there are obviously fears that she would be, with those other two that I mentioned, be considered kind of a hostage.
Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Over there.
Yeah, also thank you again for coming. Really appreciate your time and admire both of your bravery in reporting from the field. Just one quick question. I read an interview recently with the foreign minister under Yeltsin in the Financial Times, and he said the greatest mistake the West made was thinking the Cold War ended. Do you think Putin's intention has always been to launch a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, or just, because you mentioned that there was always that aggression, but was it limited to Donbass, or was it always that full-scale invasion?
Andrei Kozyrev is the...
Yes.
the front.
Going way back, you mean, in history, like to the beginning of modern Russia, end of the Soviet Union? Yeah. No, I mean, a lot, I would say it has been coming for a long time that Vladimir Putin feels that Russia is in danger because of this belt of former Soviet states that are now independent countries, that used to be part of the Soviet Union, that a lot of them have voted with their feet and have gone over to NATO. So he has always felt that this is a very dangerous thing for Russia. Therefore, he has to, in some way, take it back. Now, sometimes he takes it back by just creating, neutering the country politically or militarily. Things like what he's done with Georgia, to have two areas, Ossetia and Abkhazia, with Russian troops. So that means that Georgia can never be part of NATO, that type of thing. What I'm worried about with Putin right now is, and Alex was talking about this, it seems very logical in a demonic way that he would want that land bridge. That seems very, very logical. But Putin right now feels illogical, and he feels very emotional. And it feels to me as if he wants to punish Ukraine. I don't know whether you feel that, but there's an element of that. So I wonder whether, in spite, he would go beyond what he would normally do under normal circumstances. And of course, if he goes beyond Donbass, Crimea, and those parts and goes toward the NATO border, we are really in some trouble. But I think, Putin looks at this, he's become a great historian. He's very interested in history and has written his treatise on Ukraine. So that end of the Cold War and beginning of modern Russia is a very neuralgic part of his understanding of history, and he wants to set it right. Dr. Stent has written books on this. She knows the subject very well.
Do you want to add anything to that?
It's hard to tell whether he's got, a vendetta, against Ukraine and what his designs are there. There are all sorts of theories that, again, he wanted to come into Kyiv, cut it off, but by all accounts, there's no sense that he thinks he can take over the country, hold the country. It would just be come in, replace the government, take this land bridge in the east. But again, you could take the land bridge and just have that sliver. You could go all the way west to the Dnieper River, which basically cuts Ukraine in half. So there are all these different theories. But I think probably the most important thing at this point is the recognition that he knows he can't lose. You know, he can't walk away from things right now. He's got to, at least in his mind, follow through on this so that whenever the diplomatic conversations actually start in earnest, he's got a solid leg to stand on. The thinking earlier on was he would come in and do all this within a week and then really start the negotiations. Obviously, he's not where he wants to be right now, so he's got, we believe, he thinks he's got to do quite a bit more in order to be in some sort of position to negotiate from a position of strength.
I think we had a question here.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to all of you for speaking with us today. My name is Jack Gazdia, and I'm a sophomore in the SFS as well. And for my question, I was curious to what extent you encounter hesitancy in kind of trying to get those personal narratives and those personal stories that you were talking about. There is, of course, the language barrier, as you mentioned, but Professor Dougherty, you also talked about how the Russian propaganda has somewhat demonized the United States. And is there a reluctance among people in Russia, and especially in eastern Ukraine, to talk and to give their stories to American journalists in particular?
Alex, why don't we start with you?
I think there's an evolution, and I'll be very curious to hear what Jill has to say about people in Russia, because obviously there's a lot more fear there. There's an evolution because in the early days of a conflict where people feel like they are the victims and are the victims, they are very eager to get their story out. Obviously, you're going to run into people who are just going through so much and who are so traumatized that they don't want to talk to you, and that's perfectly understandable. And so that you have to navigate very gingerly and respectfully. But then there are going to be people who are very, very eager to tell their stories. If I were ever to go back to Ukraine during this conflict, I think I would probably run into situations where people are just so tired of journalists and so tired of telling their stories, and they're just trying to focus on living, whether it's living where they are or trying to get out or whatever it is, that they might be more reluctant to tell their story. So I do think throughout the course of a conflict, there is an evolution, but right now, Ukraine knows that the eyes of the world are on it, and they are very eager to be heard.
You know, over time, I think it has changed too. Most of my career, people were, especially after the end of the Soviet Union, people were very happy to talk to anyone and would go on at length about all sorts of subjects because they do have opinions. Recently, because of what was happening with the war, most of the stuff that we did was talking with people at protests. Because it's very hard just to stand on a street corner and ask random people. You can do that, but we were at protests. And most of those people have a particular point of view. You know, they are anti-Putin, anti-government, anti-war. So, and they were usually very willing to talk, and they did not care that we were Americans. But right now, it's very, very dangerous to express your opinion. There have been people at protests. One woman, you probably saw the video, where she had a sign that had nothing on it, literally nothing on it. And she was hauled off by the police. So no matter what you do, you can be arrested. And for young people, you know, 2 strikes and you're out. 3 strikes, you're really out. 1 strike, they might let you go home. They might fine you. 2 strikes, you probably will end up in jail. And then 3 strikes, you really could end up for an extended period plus fines. So a lot of people are not willing to do that, and young people could end up having their academic career completely stopped. You know, they might be kicked out of school, which would mean they would never get a good job. So it's become really bad.
Well, we have come to the end of our time. Please join me in thanking Jill and Alex for an excellent session. Thank you.